this computer. All right, welcome class. This will be the review for your first final. Basically, it is the review of the last slide of each lecture that we've had. So the first final will be on your first 6 chapters of the book, as well as any Nevada readings that I've put into the syllabus for Nevada Constitution. So the first chapter that we talked about was actually a combination of chapter 1 and chapter 2. So the things you need to know from the first 2 chapters is you need to understand what American exceptionalism is. So please don't skimp on this by thinking you know what it means just by looking at the word, because it is actually the philosophy when America was first founded, that at that time no other country had experimented in trying to form a government for the people, by the people, of the people. And so it explains, I talk about it in the lecture and explains about it in your text. So please be able to know what American exceptionalism is. And it kind of leads to the next one that's highlighted. So American exceptionalism was the first time that a country had used these unique ideas, and they're the 7 ideas that we talked about in, I believe it was the 2nd chapter, and that were things like liberty and self-government, limited government, self-rule, limited government, religion, and freedom of religion. So look at those 7 ideals again. You've already chosen one for your discussion question to write on. But anything that I have today that's highlighted in yellow will be an essay question. So you'll need to elaborate. You can't just give me a sentence or 2 or even just 1 paragraph, but a short essay. So doesn't have to be super lengthy, and I don't need words just to make it longer. So if you're a concise writer and you write things, you get right to the point, that's fine. But please write your essay answers in sentences, paragraphs. You know, most of them should be about 2 paragraphs, maybe 3. But for this one, I'll ask you to pick 2 key ideas. Tell me what they are. So you can't just say liberty is freedom. You know, you have to give me a little bit more on what the key idea is, and then how you have identified it in your life or in someone else's life. So a lot of you did, you know, the American dream. You can use the one you used in the book, but if it were me, I would want to learn a little bit more, and so I would pick 2 different ones. But you're more than welcome to use the one that you used in your discussion question. Sorry, not in the book. You need to know the difference between negative liberty and positive liberty. If it's not highlighted here today, it's usually going to be a multiple choice question. Oh, and I should address that right away. For those of you who haven't watched my many videos, there will be 50 multiple choice questions, or actually, I think on this one, there's really only 48. And then after that, there will be several, I think around 5, anywhere from 5 to 7. Each essay is different, short essay questions, and they'll be worth a lot more. So please be prepared and do your studying, because by the time you get, if you're going to be looking up each answer of the multiple choice questions, by the time you get to the essay questions, you'll have run out of time. So you need to be prepared. Okay, so negative, positive liberty, there'll just be a multiple choice question on that. You'll need to know what direct democracy is. We have the tools of direct democracy in Nevada, where we can actually vote for initiatives. We can actually put initiatives on the ballot. We can put a referendum on the ballot, which is an existing law where you say, yeah, everybody votes for it or against it. So citizens in Nevada have a lot of direct democracy power, where we can actually vote. We did that with legalizing marijuana. We don't have that kind of direct democracy on the federal level. We have representative democracy, where we elect someone to represent us. We also elect someone to represent us in Nevada, but in addition to that, we're able to vote on issues as well. Recalls, that's when we call someone out of office. These three are only for Nevada. Sunshine laws are any laws that expose what the government is doing and allow us to see what they're doing so that we can comment on it, we can call our representatives. So that would be direct democracy. So we do have some level on the federal, some ability to affect laws on the federal level, but it takes a lot of effort for us. We actually have to pick up the phone or dial or write a letter. You need to know the definition of politics, who gets what, where, when, and how we divide up the money that we collect in taxes, where they use it to provide us services. So that was that elevator analogy we talked about, where depending on what the government service is, you may receive something. You may, or maybe your family members, or maybe a neighbor might receive something. You might not. But deciding how much money the government puts towards each issue, that's the basis definition of politics. I think your book also says how we make collective decisions. So I like to simplify it. Who gets how much of the pot? You need to know the 4 largest spending programs. So by now, we talk about it in this first section. We'll talk about it more later, but can anyone tell me what the 4 largest spending programs are? That's here.
Is it Social Security?
Yep.
Would welfare be considered like one too, or is that like a broader?
Welfare is a broad type of policy where it might include things like food stamps and stuff like that, but that's actually not a very big portion of where we spend our money. But Medicare and Medicaid, those two, so those are about health care, and Medicaid goes to people who don't have enough money or people with disabilities, and Medicare goes to senior citizens, everyone over 65. So those are the 3 big entitlement programs. And then what's the 4th one? Can you remember what
military?
Yeah, defense, military. Yeah. So you need to know those 4. Those are a huge portion of our budget. So whenever we're talking, if they're talking about cutting, Sesame Street from public radio, they're really only talking about a tiny bit. Those are the 4 that nobody wants to touch. Well, yeah. They often talk about maybe touching Medicare and Medicaid. But if they talk about cutting Social Security or Medicare, who's going to get upset about that?
Yeah, a lot of people.
The old people, and they're the ones that vote. So anyone reaching near 65 or older, they're very strong voters or have been in the past. So those are usually not cut, but we'll talk a little bit more about that next. You just need to know those 4 for this exam. All right, thanks, Zachary. Then for the next chapter, which is on the Constitution, you need to be able to answer some questions that just identify these 4 documents. So we talk a little bit about the Declaration of Independence. We don't go into too much detail, so you just need to know what that is. It's basically the statement saying we're going to break away from England. The Articles of Confederation was the first attempt at a constitution, but it didn't last very long. It didn't have a strong enough federal government. And then we came up with the Constitution that we have now. And then you also need to know, that we also have a Nevada Constitution. For the US Constitution, you need to know the arguments that shape the Constitution. One of the questions will ask who we were in the original Constitution, who were we allowed to vote for? Because right now we can vote for the president, our senators, and our House of Representatives. But the way it was originally written, we could only vote for our House of Representatives. They voted for the senators, and then Congress picked the president. So it wasn't until later that they made amendments to the Constitution where we get to vote for senators and we get to vote for the president. So you need to know before the amendments were made who we got to vote for. And then this one is going to be one of your most important essay questions to answer. So if you have, for anyone who has skipped the lecture or haven't read the chapter on Constitution, I highly recommend you read it. But they talk about how they had a challenge between the big populated states and the smaller states, and how they were going to decide how many representatives each state got. And so there was a challenge between Virginia and New Jersey. New Jersey was a small state, so they wanted all the representatives to be equal. Virginia was a big state. They wanted all the representatives to be based on population. That would mean they would have more power, right? If they had more people, they could pass more votes. So they came up with a compromise, and the compromise was that instead of having one house based on equal representation, or the other plan was one house based on I think actually one of the plans was two houses based on popular representation. They would have two houses, which is what we have now, one based on equal representation. So in the Senate, all states are equal. In the House, the bigger states have more power because they're based on population. So you need to be able to explain that. I'll ask, what was the compromise? What was the name of it? It was called the Connecticut Compromise. And what you need to be able to explain how they decided on our representation now. And it was based on what I just said, okay? And that is really important in this section for all of us to understand how we got our representation in Congress, because next section we'll talk about how those numbers are how we get our electoral college, which is how we decide the presidency. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so don't worry about the electoral college too much now. Well, you need to know a little bit on that, but you won't have to write an essay question on it this time. You should know what checks and balances are and separation of powers. So separation of powers in the Constitution, it says the president gets to do this, Congress gets to do that, the judicial branch gets to do this. That's separation of powers. Checks and balances is when, yeah, the president gets to veto a bill, but Congress can override it, or the judicial branch can say that a law is unconstitutional, but Congress could write a new law. So those are checks and balances on each other. You should understand that concept and be able to recognize a question about it. You should know that in the Constitution, it mentions slavery 3 times. I mean, talks about slavery 3 times. One is saying that they couldn't make a law for 20 years to forbid it, so it had to stay legal. The other is the 3/5 clause, which said that when they were counting all those people in the state to get how many representatives, they weren't going to give slaves the right to vote, but they were going to try to count them, but not as a whole person, as a 3/5. And then the third one is on fugitive slaves. Like if they were found in another state, they had to be returned to their slave owners. Those all 3 eventually got amended in the amendments, but in the original Constitution, they are in there, and a place of shame for our country to look at that. You should know what the first 3 articles of the Constitution. So there's 7 articles. The first 3 talk about the 3 branches of government. So please be sure to know which is which, because I'll ask a question to make sure you know. The first one is not the executive branch. It's not about the presidency. It's about the legislative branch. It's the people's branch. So that's where the founding fathers thought the most important branch was. So they spent the most amount of time on the first article. Second article is about the executive branch, and the third article is about the judicial branch. You should also know what's in Article 1, Section 8. It's the list of all the things that Congress can do. So it lists out their enumerated powers, which is their specific powers. It talks about a bunch of different things. But then at the end, there's a clause, the necessary and proper clause, that says, oh, if we forgot to list something here, and there is something, like, for example, they didn't know about the internet in those days. If there's something in here that we think is necessary and proper for Congress to make a law on, that's also okay. Okay, so that was kind of their catch clause that gave them more power. And you should know the difference between originalism and pragmatism, which is looking at the Constitution exactly the way it says and interpreting it that way. And pragmatism is looking at the Constitution and knowing that the founding fathers put areas, hey, we may have forgotten something here, so we can't foresee the future problems. So pragmatism is using the Constitution in our present day, considering our present situation. So literally, like originalism is using the words literally, and pragmatism is using it objectively for the present time. All right, then for federalism, federalism is kind of a continuation of looking at the Constitution and finding out what parts of the Constitution give the federal government power and what parts of the Constitution give the state government power. So the one thing I need everyone to understand that I noticed in the discussion questions is that federalism isn't about the branches of government. It's not about the executive branch. Those are all on the federal level. We also have it on the state level, but it's about the levels of government. What powers, so legalization of marijuana is the best example, seems to be the most popular. On the federal level, it is illegal. On the state level, many states have legalized it because they have that power given to them in the 10th Amendment that says, hey, there might be other powers that the state, that we haven't forbidden the state to have, but we don't know about. So the states get to regulate on that. They didn't think about marijuana 230 years ago. So the states are able to legislate on it, but then there's also a supremacy clause in the Constitution that says if the state and federal government have a conflict, the federal government wins. They're supreme. So that's what federalism is. It's kind of the balance of power between the state and federal government and the challenges that we have. So legalization of marijuana is a challenge now. We don't know what to do about it until either the federal government tells all those states you can't legalize it, which probably won't happen, hopefully, or the Congress makes a law and takes marijuana off of the class 1 narcotics list. Okay, so again, you need to know Article 1, Section 8. I just talked about that. The necessary and proper clause is in there. I talked about that. The Commerce Clause means that the federal government can regulate anything that is between states or between countries. So Nevada can't make laws between California and Utah and Nevada or Arizona just because they're bordered by them. They're not allowed to do that. Only the federal government is. So commerce between states and between countries is done on the federal level. Full faith and credit clause, we talked about this. This is when licenses and legal records in one state needs to be recognized in other states. Not all, like if you get a state beauty license in the state of Nevada, you'd have to get the California version. But if you got a license, like a driver's license, you're still able to drive in another state. They have to recognize, or a marriage license. And that's where this clause was brought in when they talked about, when the court looked at same-sex marriages. If you got married in a state where it was legal, the other states had to recognize it. But then they eventually also looked at the 14th Amendment and said every person gets the equal protection under the law, and it doesn't matter who you marry to get that. So reserved powers, this was the 10th Amendment that I talked about. So it basically said, if there's something in the Constitution that is not forbidden by the states, or that is not delegated to the federal government, then it is reserved for the states. So that's called the Reserve Clause. It's the 10th Amendment. Concurrent powers are powers that both the state and the federal government hold, like taxing. They both can tax their citizens. They both can build roads and highways. They both can make business laws. So there are some things that they can both do at the same time. Those are called concurrent powers. And then the types of federalism, you'll have to watch the lecture or read in the book about this, but this just shows the layer cake and the marble cake. So you should be able to just at least those two types. The layer cake is like a chocolate and vanilla cake, and it's clear, distinct lines. So the federal government, like for education, the federal government can give funds to the states, but the state governments decide on what their education is. So those are clear. The marble cake is where it gets a little confusing, like healthcare. You know, the federal government gives funds, they also make some regulations, but the state government has to administer everything and decide how many people get the healthcare within their state. So it's a little more confusing. That would be the marble cake. Okay, so that's federalism. Civil liberties. So civil liberties and civil rights, if you've watched the videos, you can tell that they're very similar. They're talking about our rights in both of them, but it's the way you need to know the difference between civil liberties and civil rights. And that was your discussion question this week. If I were you, I would definitely make sure you answer that first before you take the exam, just so you're clear on the difference. So civil liberties is our protection against the government intruding on our rights. And civil rights demands that the government protects us. And civil rights is usually about groups of people who are being discriminated against. Civil liberties is more an individual person keeping their rights. You'll need to know about the 14th Amendment, really important amendment. And then you'll need to understand selective incorporation of Bill of Rights. So the first 10 amendments were the Bill of Rights, and that was basically the founding fathers saying, oops, we forgot. Well, they didn't forget. They just didn't pass it the first time, but we're going to add in these rights that people have. But even though they did that, states, especially southern states, would make laws that would take away people's rights to do that, to have those rights. So somebody would have to bring a court case to the court, and the court would say, they would point to the 14th Amendment and say, everyone has equal protection under the law. You cannot, state of wherever, you cannot make this law because it's taking away people's rights. And that was called selective incorporation of the Bill of Rights. So one right at a time, somebody had to, so it was basically the federal government said everybody had these rights, but the states were ignoring it, and still do to this day, because many states now are starting to take away people's rights to vote by making it harder and harder to vote. So those laws will be brought to the court, and the courts will decide. And if they look at the 14th Amendment, they'll have to say everybody has the right to vote, so you can't restrict them from voting, right? Or they'll have to make that decision. All right, so that's selective incorporation of Bill of Rights. Right to privacy is a right that is not clearly defined in the Constitution, but has shadows of it in many different areas. So for example, if we have the right to not house soldiers in our house, which is the Third Amendment, it says you do not have to, the government cannot put people in your house and make you take care of them, right? So if you have that right, then that also means that you have the right to privacy within your house. The government can't put people in your house, right? And if you have the right to religion, then the government can't go into your brain or come into your prayer groups or come into your place of worship and tell you what to do. So they've looked at those rights to, and also the Ninth Amendment says that we may have forgotten some rights. That doesn't mean there are not more rights to be had. So the founding fathers knew that it was an incomplete document and that there might be more rights. So the courts, especially in deciding about the contraceptive, whether people could use condoms or not, was not a government issue. That was a right to privacy. And then they used that right to privacy to pass the decision on Roe v. Wade as far as abortion. So you should understand the right to privacy there. Freedom of religion has two parts to the clause. The government cannot establish a religion. That's called the Establishment Clause. And we have the free exercise to practice or not practice our own religion. Freedom of speech, you need to understand about the clause of clear and present danger. If someone is speaking and it's going to cause a riot or an insurrection, that's not free. And that has been judged on through the years by the courts. Symbolic speech is free. This is something that's not using words, like burning a flag, wearing a MAGA hat, bending a knee before a football game. Those are all signs of symbolic speech. That, for the most part, is protected under freedom of speech, unless, of course, it causes destruction or violence. The exclusionary rule is the rule in court that something cannot be used against you if it's found without a search warrant or if it's found illegally. So it can't be used in court, although sometimes that has happened. And then the Miranda warnings, this is one of the Miranda court case was that I'm sure if anyone's watched a detective movie or CSI, you've heard people's rights being read to them. You have the right to remain silent, you have the right to counsel, all those things. Then you should know what the Patriot Act is. This happened after 9/11. It was basically giving the government a little bit more freedom to look into our emails, it was mainly to find terrorists, but it's still in effect. And so there are things that the government is allowed to do under the Patriot Act that infringes upon our civil liberties. And that is where civil liberty, the protection of civil liberties came challenged up against security of our nation, of being attacked. And the security of our nation won out, and we had to lose a few of our civil liberties. Although that's still, we'll see, that's still kind of a challenge right now. And then for the chapter on civil rights, looks like you have the most essay questions. These are kind of civil rights and civil liberties mixed, but you'll need to know what Jim Crow meant. These were laws that I just talked about in the South, primarily in the South, that were laws that were discriminating and eventually were brought to court and disbanded. They weren't allowed to use those laws, mostly against voting. So it was after the Civil War and slavery was no more, but it still existed de facto in the law. So it might not have been de jure discrimination, which means the law might not have said Black people can't vote, but de facto discrimination right after slavery, you have to fill out a full exam before you can vote. You have to interpret the state constitution, something really difficult for a group of people who hadn't been going to school for their whole lives because they'd been working in slavery positions. So those were de facto discrimination laws. Now we're seeing a new set of Jim Crow laws trying to be passed in Republican states. So if you've listened to any of the things that I've posted regarding what's actually happening now in our states, it's getting a little scary. It's going back to restricting people from voting and hitting more people of color and people of low income to not allow them to vote in many states. So we'll see what happens there. Plessy v. Ferguson is a court case that we talked about in this chapter. This is where a Black man bought a first-class ticket and was kicked off the first-class train, said he had to go to the third-class train, and he brought it to court and said, hey, 14th Amendment, I get equal protection under the law. And they said, oh, yeah, you do. It's equal, but it's separate. So you just have to be in a separate car. And so this was passed, and for many, many decades, that was the law that, newly freed slaves and people of color would be able to go to the restroom, but it had to be a separate restroom or a separate restaurant or a separate park. So until Board v. Brown, I'm sorry, Brown v. Board of Education, this separate but equal was in place. So you'll have an exam essay question on Brown v. Board of Education, and I'll want you to answer a couple things. And this is the way you'll be answering questions in the next exam about judicial court cases. You need to tell me what the case was about. So just briefly, I've given you a video of it. I talk about it in the lecture, and it's written about in the book. And I think all of you have heard this court case before, but I would watch the video just so you understand a little bit more about it, because it's a pretty fascinating case. It wasn't just one little girl. It was a bunch of families brought their cases together, and the all-white Supreme Court unanimously voted that, yeah, they looked at it and they said, you know what? They were wrong in Plessy v. Ferguson. Separate but equal is not equal. These Black American children are not getting equal education in these separate schools. So anyway, you have to tell me what the court case was about, how the judges decided, why it was important. Because, well, one, it overturned separate but equal, but two, it desegregated, what happened? It desegregated the schools, not right away. As your book tells you, it took a good decade. No schools, or barely 1% of the schools, are desegregated. It took Congress to come in now after the court case and say, all right, we're not giving you any more federal funds until you desegregate your schools. So then slowly but surely, all the schools became desegregated. I know that seems past tense to you guys because we have completely diverse schools, especially in Nevada, but it didn't used to be that way. You should know what affirmative action, these are any kind of laws that try to help people of color get educated or get jobs that they were discriminated against in the past. Laws of coverture and the 19th Amendment. So laws of coverture was the law brought over from England that women could only have any kind of political action through their husbands. And then the 19th Amendment is when women got the right to vote. You should go through, there's 27 amendments, and there's several of them that have to do with voting. One gave Black men the right to vote, one gave women the right to vote, one gave people 18 and over the right to vote. We got to vote for senators. There was a poll tax. So I'm going to ask you to write about 3 of them. So you can just write it in a simple sentence. Tell me which amendment it was and what the voting change was. You need to remember in the book and in the lectures, I talk about the fears that are triggered by immigrants. You need to know what the Japanese, in the Japanese internment camps, what was taken away from Japanese American citizens. Does anybody know what was taken away from them? No?
The Japanese internment camps.
Yep.
I think they were like they got moved to like Hawaii and Utah. Is that right?
There was some in Utah. There was one in Nevada, California, Hawaii. But when they put them in the camps, what was taken away from them?
I think it was it their property they got taken, like land and stuff, and also they could only bring like a backpack or something.
Yeah, their property, their things, their money, their jobs were lost, and their liberties. They lost all their liberties. They weren't able to do anything, and they were interned for a couple years. So yeah, so just basically everything is the answer to that. But yeah.
But when they were released, did they get their land back or no?
No. And they fought it for decades, and they finally, I think like in the 80s, they finally got some kind of reparations. But most of them were, really old by then, and there were not that many left, and it was a small amount of money compared to what they had gone through. Yeah. Okay, and then as far as Native Americans, you need to know the Native American death toll. So as the pilgrims came over and started making states from the East Coast. By the time they got to the West Coast, they estimated there were 10 million Native Americans here, but by the time they got to the West Coast, there was only 1 million left. That's 90% of them died. That's a huge amount, a huge death toll. And then you'll also need to know what we call Native American lands. So it's domestic dependent nation. So domestic meaning they live within the United States. Dependent means they're dependent on the federal government. But nation means they're separate. So they're not part of the states and they can make their own laws. You'll need to know what the ADA stands for, the American Disability Act, and just briefly describe to me what that is. Doesn't have to, it can just be a paragraph. And then you'll also need to know what kind of advocacy the gay community did in the 80s. They worked with politicians, they worked with health organizations, they worked with physicians and pharmaceutical companies, all trying to find help and aid and encourage research to combat AIDS. But they became very politically active to help their community. And then you also need to know what the don't ask, don't tell policy is. This is, so originally gay people were not allowed to be in the military. And then it became, during the Clinton administration, they wanted to do away with that, but it was really hard to pass a law to do away with that. So they came up with a don't ask, don't tell policy. They said, okay, you can be in the service, but don't tell us about it and we won't ask you about it. And that was during the Clinton administration. And then however many years later, I guess 12, 16 years later, Obama administration did away with it. And then the Trump administration banned transgender recently from the military, but that was quickly overturned once we got a new president. So those are kind of policies with the military, and the military is a bureaucracy underneath the president, and that's why the president can make certain policies. But Congress could also make a law and say it's forbidden to discriminate against anyone in the military. They haven't done so yet. So if they did that, then each president coming in wouldn't have the choice to keep changing the policy, right? So it's the difference between a policy and a law. Okay, that is the end of my slides. Do you have any questions? Nope. Okay, it's pretty straightforward. You know, if you follow the lectures, I always point out what's going to be on the exam and then give you a slide at the end and then do this. So if you do a little studying, I'm sure everybody's going to do really good. All right. Okay, good. Nice seeing some faces. Have a great day, everyone.
Hey, perfect. Thank you. Have a good day.
Okay, thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Sure, bye.